one and only Marian Schwartz, who translates Russian fiction from classic to contemporary with many stops along the way. Earlier this year, her fifth novel by Andrei Gelasimov appeared, and her first crime novel, Polina Dashkova's Madness Treads Lightly, is just out. Marian is the recipient of many awards, including the 2014 Reed Russia Prize for Contemporary Russian Literature and the 2016 Soeurette Diehl Frasier Award from the Texas Institute of Letters. Please welcome Marian Schwartz.
I decided tonight to read something that I translated a very long time ago. And it's a book that actually is still in print. New Directions is wonderful, keeps these things in print. This is my version edition. There's a different one over there. It's by a woman named Nina Berberova, who was very important in my life and career. And she was, I can't give you her whole biography, but the important thing to know for this story is that she was born in St. Petersburg and fled the revolution in 1922. She lived in Paris from 1925 to 1950 and was very active as a sort of left-wing, but in a democratic kind of way, not a socialist way, writer, and wrote, unusually, she wrote about the people of Paris, about the emigres, and she was well known for her so-called Biencourt stories, which were about the emigres who became working class, who worked in the Renault factory in Biencourt in Paris. This is, The Tattered Cloak is a collection of her, what she considered to be her very best work, her best fiction. They're novellas. I don't know, there's about 8 of them in here. And they are set in that period. One of her characteristics is that she could write protagonists who were male or female, all sorts of people who were not her. She was not writing protagonists that were herself. This story is called The Resurrection of Mozart, and it's set at the very beginning of World War II. Well, not the beginning, it's when the people are fleeing, the Germans have come to occupy Paris, and people are fleeing Paris. She, at that point, or the main character, is living outside of Paris, so these emigres are all converging on this house for a Sunday gathering. The 2 things you need to know about this, the 2 facts, are the Battle of Sedan, which was September 1st to 2nd, 1870, a very famous battle in the Franco-Prussian War, and a reference to Marie Taglioni, who was a 19th century ballet dancer, very, very famous in the Romantic era, and she was the first dancer to dance on point. So I'll read a very little bit of Russian since I don't think anybody will understand it, but it's always colorful to read it anyway. This is called The Resurrection of Mozart. Воскрешение Моцарта. В самых первых числах июня 1940 года, то есть в те самые дни, когда французская армия начала свое последнее бесповоротное отступление после прорыва у Седана, в тихий и теплый вечер общество, состоявшее из 4 женщин и 5 мужчин, сидело в саду под деревьями в 100 верстах от Парижа. Говорили именно о Седане, о том, что в последние дни вернули этому имени, давно ставшему старомодным, как кринолин, его прежнее и роковое содержание. Говорили о том, что сам этот город, никем никогда, конечно, не виденный, умерший в дедовские времена, словно воскрес сейчас для повторения каких-то ему одному сужденных трагических событий. The Resurrection of Mozart. In the early days of June 1940, just at the time when the French army was beginning its final and irrevocable retreat after the breach at Sedan, on a quiet, warm evening, a group of 4 women and 5 men were sitting in a garden under the trees, about 30 miles from Paris. They were in fact talking about Sedan, talking of how the last few days had restored to that name, which, like crinoline, had long since gone out of fashion, the ominous connotations it had had before. This town, which none of them had ever seen, and which had died in the time of their grandfathers, seemed to have been resurrected in order to relive the tragic events that were destined for it alone. The silence was so complete that when they stopped talking and returned to their own private thoughts, they could hear through the open windows the clock ticking in the large old house. The sky was green, clear, and lovely, and the stars were just beginning to shine, so few and far-flung that they failed to form any definite pattern. The old trees, acacias, limes, neither breathed nor trembled, as if standing stock still were a safeguard against something that was invisible to men, but somehow imminent on a summer evening. The hosts and their guests had just finished supper. The table had not yet been cleared. Some wine glasses were still on the table. Slowly, the green light of the darkening sky transformed the faces of the seated company, which were now obscured by shadows. They were talking about war and about the omens of war. A young woman, a guest who had driven out from town with her husband and sister, restraining her brassy voice, remarked that she had seen a meteor a fortnight before. It was about this time of day. The sky was just as hazy. At first it looked like a falling star, but it was so long and it was so bright. You probably wouldn't even have noticed it a year ago, said another guest, smiling. This was Chabarov, a bald, robust man with a drooping black mustache and wearing a bright blue shirt. He was a groundsman at a chateau about 8 miles away and had just arrived on his bicycle. A year ago, said Vasily Georgievich Sushkov, the host, a tall man, taller than anyone else at the table, gray-haired but not yet old, with a sharp and furtive look in his eye. Yes, it was exactly a year ago today that Nivelsky died. He knew a lot of this was coming. He predicted so much of it. Well, he couldn't have picked a better time to die. At least he didn't have to see what we see. If he were resurrected, he'd either spit in disgust or break down and cry. Facing the hostess at the opposite end of the table sat a Frenchman brought along by Chabarov, but whom no one else really knew. Simply, and without any fussy apology, he asked them to translate what they were all saying. Monsieur Donneau, we were talking about the dead and what they would say if they were resurrected and saw what's going on now, replied Maria Leonidovna Sushkova. Donneau took his black pipe out of his mouth, furrowed his brow, and smiled. Is it worth waking the dead? He said, looking his hostess straight in the eye. I suppose I might well invite Napoleon to come and have a look at our times, but I'd certainly spare my parents the pleasure. Suddenly, everyone talked at once. Resurrect them for your sake or for theirs? I don't understand. Manura Crane, who had come from Paris, asked with a lively expression, not addressing anyone in particular and no longer trying to conceal her loud voice. She had a full mouth of her very own white teeth, which gave the impression of being false. If it were for their sake, then of course you'd resurrect Napoleon, and Bismarck, and Queen Victoria, and maybe even Julius Caesar. But if I could bring someone from the past back to life for my sake, just for mine, then that's an entirely different thing. That calls for some thought. Such a large choice, so many temptations. Still, silly as it sounds, I think I'd resurrect Pushkin. A charming, fun-loving, marvelous man, said Maria Leonidovna Sushkova. What a joy it would be to see him alive. Or maybe Talyoni, continued Manura Crane. I'd lock her up at home so I could look at her whenever I wanted. And then take her to America, put in Chuvara, and let the impresarios tear her to shreds. Come on, if you're going to resurrect anyone, then don't resurrect Talyoni, said Fyodor Igorovich Crane, with barely repressed irritation. He was Manura's husband, twice her age, and a friend of Sushkov's. There's no need to be frivolous. I would make the best of the occasion. I would drag Tolstoy back into God's world. Wasn't it you, dear sir, who denied the role of the individual in history? You who declared that there would be no more wars? And wasn't it you who took a skeptical view of vaccination? No, don't try to wriggle out of it now. Just have a look at the result. It was evident that Fyodor Yegorovich had scores to settle with Tolstoy, and that he had an entire text prepared should they happen to meet in the next life. Avec Taillon, on pourrait faire fortune, Chabarov repeated his thought in French. And I, gentlemen, piped in Sushkov's mother, who wore heavy violet powder and reeked of some unpleasant perfume. And I, gentlemen, would resurrect Uncle Yosha. Wouldn't he be surprised? No one who knew Uncle Yosha was, so no one said, no one knew who Uncle Yosha was, so no one said anything for a minute or two. Little by little, the conversation had drawn everyone in, taking them far from that evening, that garden, and into the past, the recent or the very distant past, as if someone had already made a firm promise to wave a magic wand and fulfill everyone's wish. So that now the only problem was in making a choice. And it was a difficult choice because no one wanted to miscalculate, especially the women. No one but Mozart will do for me, though. Yes, it has to be Mozart, Maria Leonidovna thought. There's no one else I want, and it would be useless anyway. She had decided not out of any morbid love of music, as can happen with women who have reached a certain age and who are generally thought of as cultured, but merely because she connected that name in her mind with her earliest childhood, and because it lived on as something pure, transparent, and eternal that might take the place of happiness.